Sometimes the smallest, most ordinary moments hold the power to change your life completely. That's what happened to me. One moment, I was a stepmother, hosting a polite gathering at an art gallery, navigating the usual awkwardness of family connections. The next, I was stuck in an elevator with my husband's son, a young man I had barely exchanged more than pleasantries with before that night. What happened between those steel walls wasn't something I could have anticipated. I've always prided myself on being a woman of reason, someone who could weigh choices and consequences. But the way Ian looked at me, the way he spoke as if every word mattered, it unlocked something in me that I hadn't realized was still there. It wasn't just the long hours of confinement that drew us together, nor the shared vulnerability of the situation. It was the realization of how deeply we were both yearning for something we couldn't define until we saw it in each other. By the time those elevator doors finally opened, everything in my world had shifted. And the truth? The most complicated part wasn't what happened in that confined space. It was everything that came after. The gallery was alive with soft music and the hum of polite conversation. My husband David had insisted I attend in his place. "Ian's showing his work tonight," he had said casually over breakfast, his attention already on the day's meetings. "You should go. Show him some support." I had agreed, though more out of obligation than genuine interest. Ian and I had always been cordial but distant. He was polite to me, and I did my best to respect his independence. He had lost his mother young, and I knew that my role as his father's second wife came with its own complications. When I arrived at the gallery, I spotted Ian across the room, standing beside a series of abstract paintings. He was taller than I remembered, his dark hair slightly tousled, his expression focused yet relaxed as he spoke with a small group of patrons. I waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. "Margaret," he said warmly, his smile lighting up his face. "I wasn't sure you'd make it." "Of course," I replied. "Your father couldn't come, but he sends his congratulations." We fell into easy conversation about his work, his tone a mixture of pride and self-deprecation. I noticed the way he lit up when he spoke about his art, the passion in his voice. It was a side of him I hadn't seen before, and it intrigued me. After the event, we left together. Ian offered to drive me home, but I insisted we take the elevator up together when we reached the building. It felt natural, polite even. Neither of us could have known what awaited us. The elevator hummed softly as it began its ascent. I pressed the button for the penthouse, leaning back against the polished steel wall. Ian stood beside me, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Then, with a sudden jolt, the elevator stopped. The lights flickered before settling into the dim glow of the emergency setting. Ian and I exchanged a glance. "Did it just?" he started. "It stopped," I finished, pressing the button for the intercom. No response. I tried my phone, but there was no signal. "Guess we're stuck," Ian said with a faint smile, leaning against the wall. At first, we approached the situation with practicality, taking turns calling out and knocking on the walls. When it became clear that help wasn't coming anytime soon, we sat down, resigned to waiting. As the minutes stretched into hours, we began to talk. Not just about the elevator, but about ourselves. Ian asked about my life before I met his father, and I found myself sharing stories I hadn't thought about in years. In return, he spoke about his struggles as an artist, his feelings of inadequacy, and the pressure of living up to his father's expectations. "I think he wants me to be someone I'm not," Ian admitted, his voice low. "He's always comparing me to what he was at my age. It's exhausting." "I understand," I said, surprised by how much I meant it. "David can be demanding." Ian laughed, the sound breaking through the tension in the small space. "That's putting it mildly." The more we talked, the more I saw sides of Ian I hadn't known existed. He was thoughtful and vulnerable, qualities that stood in stark contrast to the confident image he projected. And as the hours dragged on, I began to feel something I couldn't quite name, a pull, a quiet connection that unsettled and intrigued me in equal measure. When the air in the elevator grew stifling, I removed my jacket, revealing the sleeveless blouse I wore underneath. Ian's gaze flickered to me briefly before he looked away, his expression unreadable. The moment passed quickly, but the charge it left behind lingered. At some point, I drifted off to sleep, only to wake to find Ian sitting close, his hand resting lightly on mine. He pulled away when he saw my eyes open, his expression apologetic. "Sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," I said softly, my heart pounding. "It's fine." The tension between us finally reached its breaking point when Ian leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret, He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. "I don't know what I'm doing." Neither did I. But in that moment, reason and restraint gave way to something deeper, something undeniable. When his lips met mine, it was gentle at first, tentative, as if either of us could still pull back. But neither of us did. The kiss was brief, barely long enough for either of us to process what had just happened. When we pulled apart, the silence in the elevator was deafening. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, and Ian looked away, running a hand through his hair as if trying to shake the moment from his mind. "I shouldn't have," he began, his voice trailing off. "Neither of us should have," I replied quickly, my voice firm despite the turmoil swirling inside me. "We're tired, stressed, it's the situation, that's all." Ian nodded, but the look in his eyes said otherwise. The silence between us stretched on, thick with unspoken words. Finally, he broke it. "It's not just the situation," he said softly, his voice steady but barely above a whisper. "I've felt something for a while now, and I know it's wrong, but I can't ignore it anymore." His confession hit me like a wave, and for a moment I was at a loss for words. I had always seen myself as a practical, grounded woman. This, whatever it was, went against everything I believed about who I was. And yet, as I looked at Ian, I couldn't deny the flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Desire, connection, and a sense of being truly seen. "Ian," I began, my voice faltering. This can't happen. It's impossible." He nodded, though his expression remained unreadable. "I know," he said, "but that doesn't change how I feel." The tension between us remained palpable, but the conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun. When the elevator finally jolted to life hours later, neither of us spoke. We stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, each retreating to our separate rooms, as if the night had been a strange, fleeting dream. The following morning, I awoke with a heaviness in my chest. The events of the night before played on a loop in my mind. The kiss, Ian's words, the way his hand had lingered on mine, as if afraid to let go. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness brought on by the strange circumstances we'd found ourselves in. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't ignore the pang of longing that coursed through me every time I thought of him. At breakfast, David was his usual distracted self, scanning emails on his phone while sipping his coffee. Ian joined us late, his expression guarded as he muttered a quick good morning before retreating to the far end of the table. We avoided each other's eyes, the weight of our shared secret hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "Everything all right?" David asked, glancing between us. "Fine," I replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired. The elevator incident threw me off." Ian nodded in agreement, his gaze fixed on his plate. "Yeah, it was a long night." David shrugged, already moving on to the next topic. "Well, I'm glad you both made it through. These old buildings always have their quirks." In the days that followed, Ian and I did our best to maintain a sense of normalcy. He returned to his gallery work, and I threw myself into organizing a charity event I had been planning for weeks. But no matter how busy I tried to keep myself, I couldn't escape the memories of that night. The way Ian had looked at me, the way his touch had ignited something I thought I'd lost. Ian, too, seemed unable to fully let go. He found small excuses to be around me, offering to help with errands, joining me for walks in the park. Our interactions were careful, almost rehearsed, but beneath the surface the tension simmered. One evening, while David was out of town for a work conference, Ian stopped by the penthouse under the pretense of dropping off a painting. I opened the door to find him standing there, his eyes searching mine, with a mix of hesitation and resolve. "Hi," he said simply, holding the canvas under one arm. "I thought you might like this for the study." I stepped aside, letting him in. The air between us was charged, every movement and word laced with unspoken meaning. As he set the painting against the wall, I felt the urge to say something, to acknowledge the invisible thread that had been pulling us together since that night in the elevator. "Ian," I began, my voice trembling. "About what happened?" He turned to face me, his expression serious. "I haven't stopped thinking about it," he admitted. "About you." I took a step back, my heart pounding. "This isn't right," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "We can't, it's not fair to your father." "I know," he said, his voice steady, "but when I'm with you I feel alive in a way I never have before, and I think you feel it too." The truth of his words struck me like a lightning bolt. I did feel it. The spark, the connection, the sense of being truly seen. But admitting it out loud felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I could come back from. Before I could respond, Ian closed the distance between us, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down my spine. And in that moment, all my carefully constructed defenses crumbled. We kissed again, this time with a hunger that made it impossible to deny the depth of our connection. His hands rested lightly on my waist, as if giving me the chance to pull away, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, allowing myself to be swept away by the intensity of the moment. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and flushed, I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Guilt, exhilaration, fear, and longing. Ian looked at me with a mixture of awe and vulnerability, his eyes searching mine for reassurance. "I don't want to hurt anyone," I said softly, my voice breaking. "But I don't know how to stop this." "Neither do I," he replied, "but I don't want to." We stood there for a moment, the weight of our choices pressing down on us. Finally, I took a step back, forcing myself to regain some semblance of composure. "You should go," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "Before we do something we can't take back." Ian nodded, though the reluctance in his expression was clear. "I'll go," he said. "But this isn't over, Margaret. You know it isn't." As the door closed behind him, I felt a pang of regret mixed with relief. I knew he was right. This wasn't over. But I also knew that continuing down this path would come at a cost I wasn't sure I was ready to pay. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act, each day feeling like I was teetering on the edge of a precipice. Ian and I maintained our distance, though the connection between us lingered in every glance and unspoken word. But the strain of keeping our secret began to take its toll. I found myself avoiding David's gaze, my once confident demeanor replaced by a nervous edge that didn't go unnoticed. "You've been quiet lately," David remarked one evening over dinner, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. "Is everything all right?" I forced a smile, waving off his concern. "Just busy with the charity event," I replied, and the elevator ordeal shook me up more than I realized. David nodded, seemingly satisfied with my explanation. But as the days passed, his questions grew more pointed, his gaze lingering on me with a subtle suspicion that made my pulse quicken. It didn't help that Ian had begun to visit the penthouse more frequently, his reasons often flimsy at best. "I thought Margaret might need help with the event," he explained one evening, carrying a box of art supplies into the living room. David raised an eyebrow but said nothing, his expression unreadable as he watched Ian set the box down on the table. The tension in the room was palpable, and I busied myself with arranging flowers to avoid meeting either of their gazes. It wasn't long before someone else began to notice the shift in my behavior. Charlotte, my closest friend and confidant, had always been perceptive, her sharp eyes quick to pick up on even the smallest changes. "You've been distracted lately," she said one afternoon as we sipped tea on the terrace. "And don't try to tell me it's just the charity event. I know you better than that." I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Charlotte was fiercely loyal, but she was also pragmatic and unafraid to speak her mind. Finally, I sighed, setting my teacup down with a soft clink. "There's been some tension at home," I admitted, choosing my words carefully. "David and I have been a bit out of sync lately." Charlotte frowned, her gaze searching mine. "Is it just David, or is there something else going on?" Her question hung in the air, and for a moment I considered telling her the truth. But the weight of what I'd done was too heavy to share, even with someone I trusted as deeply as Charlotte. "It's complicated," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll manage." Charlotte didn't press further, though the concern in her eyes lingered. "You know I'm here for you," she said softly. "Whatever it is." I nodded, grateful for her support, even as guilt gnawed at the edges of my resolve. The breaking point came during a family dinner, one of David's rare attempts to bring us all together. Ian arrived late, his hair slightly disheveled and his expression tense. I tried not to react, but the sight of him sent a pang of longing through me that I struggled to suppress. As we ate, David began asking Ian about his gallery work, his tone veering dangerously close to criticism. "You've been spending a lot of time there," he remarked, "but I haven't seen much to show for it." Ian's jaw tightened, his fork clattering against his plate as he set it down. "Art isn't exactly a 9-to-5 job, Dad. You wouldn't understand." David's eyes narrowed. "Maybe if you spent less time exploring your process and more time focusing on results, you'd get somewhere." The tension between them crackled like a live wire, and I could feel the weight of their unspoken grievances filling the room. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "David, that's enough," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Ian's doing the best he can." Both men turned to look at me, their expressions a mixture of surprise and confusion. David's gaze darkened, and I realized too late that I had overstepped. "Since when are you his advocate?" he asked coldly, his tone cutting through the air like a knife. Ian pushed his chair back abruptly, standing up with a muttered excuse. "I need some air," he said, disappearing onto the balcony. David's eyes followed him before returning to me, his expression unreadable. "Care to explain what that was about?" I shook my head, unable to find the words. "I just thought you were being unfair," I murmured. David didn't respond, but the suspicion in his gaze was impossible to ignore. The fallout from the dinner lingered in the days that followed, the tension between David, Ian, and me creating an invisible chasm that none of us dared to cross. But the fragile balance finally shattered during an art exhibit at Ian's gallery. David attended begrudgingly, his presence a rare gesture of support for his son. The evening began uneventfully, with polite conversation and glasses of champagne, but it didn't take long for tempers to flare. As David examined one of Ian's paintings, he made a dismissive comment about its abstract style. "It's interesting," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "But I don't see how it's worth what you're charging." Ian's face flushed with anger, and before I could intervene he fired back. "Maybe if you spent less time looking for flaws and more time trying to understand, you'd get it." Their argument quickly escalated, drawing the attention of nearby patrons. I stepped forward, placing a hand on David's arm in an attempt to defuse the situation. "David, please," I said softly. "Let it go." He turned to me, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Why are you defending him?" he demanded, his voice rising. "What's going on between you two?" The question hung in the air, freezing me in place. Ian's eyes widened, and I could see the realization dawning on his face that our secret was no longer safe. Later that evening, back at the penthouse, David confronted me. He had pieced together enough from the dinner and gallery incident to know that something was wrong. "I want the truth, Margaret," he said, his voice low but seething with anger. "What's going on with you and Ian?" I hesitated, my mind racing as I tried to find a way to explain. But the weight of the secret was too much to bear, and the words spilled out before I could stop them. "It's not what you think," I began, though even I knew how hollow the excuse sounded. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. I never meant for it to happen." David's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "How long?" he demanded. "How long has this been going on?" It hasn't," I stammered, tears welling in my eyes. "It was just once, I swear." His laugh was bitter, a sound filled with pain and disbelief. "Do you expect me to believe that, after everything I've seen?" The days after David's confrontation passed in a haze of tension and silence. He had retreated to the guest room, leaving the penthouse steeped in a cold, unbearable quiet. Ian, aware of what had transpired, stopped visiting altogether. For the first time in years, the home I had shared with David felt like a prison. I spent my days pacing the apartment, replaying the confrontation in my mind. David had left me with an ultimatum: end any contact with Ian and leave the penthouse, or face the public fallout of his accusations. His words had been clear and final, devoid of any willingness to reconcile. One afternoon, I found myself standing by the large bay window, looking out at the city below. The skyline was bathed in golden light, yet I felt none of its warmth. Instead, I felt the weight of my choices bearing down on me, a suffocating reminder of everything I stood to lose. As much as I cared for Ian, I knew that continuing our relationship would only deepen the fractures in all of our lives. And as much as I resented David for his coldness, I couldn't deny the truth of his words. I had betrayed him, not just as a wife, but as someone who had promised to be a part of his family. The next morning, I packed a small suitcase. I left behind most of my belongings, knowing that carrying them would feel like dragging the weight of my mistakes with me. I wrote David a note, leaving it on the kitchen counter where he would find it after I was gone. Before leaving the city, I made one last stop, Ian's gallery. It was closed that day, the windows dark, but I found him inside, sitting amidst a clutter of half-finished canvases. He looked up as I entered, surprise and relief washing over his face. "Margaret," he said softly, standing as I approached. "I wasn't sure I'd see you again." I hesitated, unsure of how to begin. Finally I spoke. "Ian, I wanted to say goodbye. I'm leaving the penthouse, leaving all of it behind." His expression flickered with pain, and he stepped closer. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We can figure it out. We can find a way." I shook my head, tears threatening to spill. "Ian, we both know this isn't sustainable. What we had, it was beautiful, but it can't last. Not like this." He reached for my hand, his grip warm and steady. "You've meant more to me than I can say," he said, his voice trembling. "You made me believe in myself, in my art, in everything I thought I'd lost. And you reminded me of who I used to be," I replied, my voice breaking. "But we have to let go for both of our sakes." For a long moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of our goodbye settling over us. Finally, Ian pulled me into an embrace, holding me as if trying to memorize the feel of me before letting go. When I left the gallery, I didn't look back. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild my life. I moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, a modest but comfortable space that felt like a blank slate. I returned to teaching part-time, finding solace in the rhythm of sharing knowledge and connecting with others. David and I finalized our divorce quietly, with little fanfare. He didn't fight me for much, and I didn't ask for anything more than a clean break. Our marriage, once filled with promise, had dissolved into something neither of us could salvage. Ian, too, began a new chapter. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had accepted an art residency abroad, a prestigious opportunity that would take him to Europe for a year. Knowing that he was pursuing his dreams brought me a sense of peace, even as I missed him with an ache that lingered in the quiet moments of my days. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I found myself reflecting on everything that had transpired. The events of the past year felt like a whirlwind, a series of choices and emotions that had upended the life I had carefully constructed. And yet, as painful as it had been, I didn't regret it. My time with Ian had awakened something in me, a spark, a sense of vitality that I hadn't felt in decades. He had reminded me of the beauty and connection in taking risks, even when the outcome was uncertain. I had lost much: my marriage, my home, the sense of stability that had defined my life for so long. But I had gained something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of myself and the courage to embrace the unknown. The memory of Ian remained with me, not as a source of regret, but as a reminder of the complexities of love and the ways it can shape us. He had been a fleeting yet profound presence in my life, a chapter that I would carry with me as I moved forward. As the last rays of sunlight faded, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. My story wasn't over. It was simply taking a new direction, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever came next. It started with the snow, thick, heavy flakes that covered the world in white and made the roads impassable. I should have stayed home, but I didn't. And because of that, I found myself stranded with him, a stranger with kind eyes, a devilish smile, and a way of making me forget the world outside the cabin even existed. The forecast had said flurries, nothing more. A light dusting, they called it, something scenic to set the tone for the winter season. But as I drove deeper into the mountains, the flurries turned into something far more menacing. The snow fell heavier, thick curtains of white blurring the road ahead. My tires crunched against the fresh layer of snow, and my hands gripped the wheel tighter with every mile. I should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at me to get off the mountain road and find a hotel. But I'd been stubborn, insistent on finishing my drive to the cabin I'd rented for the weekend. A chance to clear my head, I'd told myself. A brief escape from the deadlines, the noise, and the crushing monotony of my life. But now, I wasn't sure I'd make it. The road was slick, winding in treacherous curves. I could barely see the trees lining the edge of the asphalt, their dark shapes swallowed by the storm. My headlights reflected off the snow, illuminating nothing but an endless white void. The car's tires skidded, and I let out a sharp gasp, my pulse spiking. The vehicle veered slightly, but I managed to steady it, my heart thudding against my ribs. "Damn it," I muttered under my breath. Just as I thought I was in the clear, the car hit a patch of ice. This time, there was no recovery. The tires lost their grip entirely, and the car slid sideways, spinning in a slow, terrifying arc. Everything moved in slow motion, the wheel jerking in my hands, the trees rushing closer, the sound of the tires grinding against the ice. And then, with a sickening crunch, the car slid off the road and into a shallow ditch. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel and staring out into the storm. The engine sputtered before falling silent, leaving me in eerie stillness. I tried to restart the car, but the engine only coughed in protest. My breath came out in short, sharp bursts, fogging up the windshield. I pressed my forehead against the wheel, muttering a string of curses. I was stranded. I pulled out my phone, but of course there was no signal. The screen stared back at me mockingly, the little no-service icon in the corner sealing my fate. For a moment, panic threatened to overtake me. I was alone on a desolate mountain road, with no way to call for help, and no clue how far I was from the nearest town. Then, out of nowhere, a pair of headlights cut through the swirling snow. I froze, squinting into the blinding light as a pickup truck came to a slow stop behind my car. The driver's door opened, and a tall figure stepped out, pulling up the hood of his jacket to shield himself from the storm. I rolled down my window cautiously as he approached, my fingers tightening around the handle of the door just in case. "You all right in there?" the man called, his voice carrying over the howling wind. "I think so," I replied, my voice shaky. "But my car's stuck." He nodded, glancing at the front of my car where it had sunk into the ditch. "Yeah, you're not going anywhere in this storm. Roads are too icy. Do you have a place to stay nearby?" "I was heading to a cabin, but I don't think I'm getting there tonight." He hesitated for a moment, then said, "I've got a place not far from here. You can ride out the storm there, better than freezing out here." Under normal circumstances, I would have refused. A stranger offering to take me to a secluded cabin sounded like the start of a bad thriller novel. But I didn't have much of a choice. The temperature was plummeting, and I didn't fancy spending the night in a powerless car while a snowstorm raged outside. "All right," I said, grabbing my bag from the passenger seat. "Thank you." The man helped me out of the car, his hand steady on my arm as I stepped onto the slick, snow-covered ground. I got my first good look at him then. Broad shoulders, strong jawline, piercing green eyes that caught the faint glow of the truck's headlights. "I'm Ryan," he said, his grip firm but not overbearing. "Helen," I replied, my breath visible in the freezing air. The ride to Ryan's cabin was silent, save for the rumble of the truck's engine and the sound of the snow pelting against the windows. I stole a few glances at him as he drove, trying to gauge the kind of man who would stop to help a stranger in the middle of a storm. He looked young, mid-20s maybe, and had the kind of rugged charm you'd expect from someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. His jacket was worn but well kept, and his hands gripped the steering wheel with a kind of quiet confidence. "You're lucky I came down this way," he said eventually, breaking the silence. "Not many people drive this road during a storm like this." "I guess I owe you one," I said, my voice still shaky. He glanced at me, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Just glad I got to you before the storm got worse." The cabin came into view a few minutes later, nestled between tall pine trees that swayed in the wind. It was small but cozy looking, with smoke curling from the chimney and warm light spilling out from the windows. Ryan parked the truck and helped me out, his hand once again steady on my arm as we made our way up the icy steps. "Come on in," he said, holding the door open for me. The cabin was even cozier on the inside. A a crackling fire in the stone hearth, a worn leather couch, and shelves lined with books and knickknacks. It smelled faintly of cedar and something warm like cinnamon or vanilla. "Make yourself comfortable," Ryan said, pulling off his jacket and hanging it by the door. "I'll grab some blankets." I nodded, still feeling slightly out of place as I hovered near the fireplace. My clothes were damp from the snow, and I held my hands out toward the flames, letting the heat seep into my skin. Ryan returned a moment later, a stack of blankets in his arms. He set them on the couch, and then disappeared into the small kitchen, returning with 2 steaming mugs of tea. "Here," he said, handing one to me. "This'll warm you up." "Thank you," I said, wrapping my hands around the mug. For a while, we just sat there in silence, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the room. Slowly, the tension in my chest began to ease, replaced by a quiet gratitude. "Do you live here alone?" I asked finally, breaking the silence. Ryan nodded. "Yeah, I work as a wilderness guide, so I'm out in the mountains most of the time. The cabin's just a place to crash between trips." "It's nice," I said, glancing around the room. He smiled, his green eyes crinkling at the corners. "It does the job." The storm outside showed no sign of letting up. As the wind howled and the snow piled higher, I realized I wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. For better or worse, I was stranded. With him, the wind didn't stop. It roared against the cabin, shaking the windows and blanketing the world in a thick, impenetrable white. As I sat on Ryan's couch, wrapped in one of the blankets he'd given me, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I wasn't leaving tonight, or maybe even tomorrow. I was completely at the mercy of the storm. Ryan moved around the cabin with the calm efficiency of someone who had weathered storms like this before. He threw another log onto the fire, the flames flaring up in response, their warmth filling the small space. I watched him as he worked, his movements steady and sure. He didn't seem fazed by the weather, or by the fact that he had a stranded stranger sitting in his living room. I, on the other hand, couldn't seem to relax. My clothes were still damp, my muscles tense from hours of driving in the snow. The hot tea Ryan had given me earlier helped, but it did little to quiet the nagging thoughts in my mind. What if the storm lasted for days? What if the power went out completely? What if this man, this stranger, wasn't as kind as he seemed? I shook the thought away. Ryan had done nothing but help me since the moment he found me on the side of the road. Still, being alone with him in such an isolated place made me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt in years. The room grew darker as the storm blocked out the last remnants of daylight. The small cabin had only one lantern, and the firelight to fight back the shadows. Ryan returned from the kitchen, carrying a plate with 2 sandwiches. He placed one in front of me without a word, then sat in the armchair across from the couch. I wasn't hungry, but I forced myself to eat. The quiet crunch of bread was the only sound between us for a while, aside from the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it wasn't easy either. I was too aware of everything. Of how quiet it was, of how close we were, of how his eyes flicked to me every so often, like he was trying to figure me out. After dinner, Ryan stood and began tidying up. I watched him stack the empty plates in the sink, his shoulders broad and his movements unhurried. He seemed so at ease here, so at home in the solitude. I envied him. For years, my life had been a blur of deadlines and responsibilities, always rushing from one thing to the next. Even now, I felt the pull of my phone, the emails waiting in my inbox, the to-do list I'd left unfinished. But none of that mattered here. Out in the mountains, in the middle of a snowstorm, there was nothing to do but sit and wait. I should have hated it. But strangely, I didn't. Ryan came back to the living room, sitting on the armrest of his chair. The firelight danced across his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the quiet confidence in his expression. I studied him for a moment, trying to piece him together. He was younger than me by a good 20 years, but there was something about him that felt older, steadier, more grounded. He caught me staring, and I quickly averted my eyes, my cheeks flushing. The storm raged on as the hours passed, and I found myself growing more comfortable despite myself. The heat from the fire seeped into my bones, the blanket draped around my shoulders a cocoon of warmth. At some point I leaned back against the couch, letting my head rest against the cushion. My body felt heavy, my mind drifting as exhaustion caught up with me. I didn't realize I'd fallen asleep until I felt a gentle touch on my shoulder. I opened my eyes to see Ryan standing over me, his expression soft. "You should get some rest," he said quietly. "You'll be more comfortable in the bed." I blinked up at him, my thoughts sluggish. "What about you?" "I'll take the couch," he said simply. The bed was small but warm, the thick quilt smelling faintly of pine. I sank into it gratefully, my body aching from the tension of the day. As I lay there, listening to the muffled roar of the storm outside, my mind wandered back to Ryan. There was something about him that put me on edge, but not in the way I'd expected. He didn't make me feel unsafe. If anything, he made me feel too safe, too seen. It had been years since I'd let anyone close to me. After my husband died, I'd built walls around myself, keeping everyone at arm's length. It was easier that way, easier to keep moving, to keep working, to pretend I didn't need anything or anyone. But tonight, in this cabin, with the storm outside and the firelight flickering against the walls, those walls felt thinner. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but the warmth of the bed and the quiet hum of Ryan moving around the cabin stayed with me, wrapping around me like a second blanket. The power went out sometime after midnight. I woke to complete darkness, the only light coming from the faint embers in the fireplace. For a moment, panic gripped me, sharp and suffocating. Then I heard movement in the living room, the sound of Ryan stoking the fire. I pulled the quilt tighter around me, listening to the steady rhythm of his movements. It was strangely comforting, knowing he was there. The cabin grew warmer as the fire flared back to life, its light chasing away the shadows. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts too tangled to sort through. Finally, I got up. Ryan glanced up as I stepped into the living room, his face half lit by the fire. He was sitting on the couch, a blanket draped over his lap, his expression calm but alert. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, sitting down in the armchair. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward this time. It was heavy, meaningful, like the storm outside had pressed pause on the world and left us in a bubble of stillness. I watched the fire, the flames licking at the logs, their heat warming my face. Ryan shifted slightly, his gaze flicking to me. I could feel his attention on me, even when I wasn't looking at him. It made my skin tingle, my breath hitch. Eventually, I looked up, meeting his eyes. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence stretching between us. I didn't know what I was expecting him to do. Maybe nothing. But there was something in his expression, something quiet and intense, that made my chest tighten. I broke the moment first, glancing away and pretending to adjust the blanket around my shoulders. "You should try to sleep," Ryan said finally, his voice softer now. I nodded, but I didn't move. As the fire crackled and the storm howled, I realized I wasn't scared anymore. Not of the storm, not of being stranded, not of him. And that scared me most of all. The storm continued to rage outside, but by the next morning, the world felt quieter somehow. The snow was piled high against the cabin windows, creating an insulated stillness that made every sound feel magnified. The crackle of the fire, the soft shuffle of Ryan moving around the room, even my own breath. I stayed wrapped in the quilt Ryan had given me, sitting near the fire and watching the snow swirl outside. He'd been up early, making coffee and clearing a path to the porch, though it seemed futile given how quickly the snow filled it back in. He moved with purpose, as if keeping busy was his way of keeping control. I envied that about him. His ease in a situation that would have made anyone else feel helpless. I, on the other hand, felt completely out of place. Being stuck here, with no work emails to respond to, no deadlines to meet, and no way to distract myself, left me feeling exposed in a way I hadn't expected. Ryan glanced at me occasionally, his gaze lingering just a second too long before he turned back to whatever he was doing. I wasn't sure if I imagined it, but there was a tension in the air. Something unspoken but impossible to ignore. After lunch, Ryan suggested we clear the snow off the porch again. It was still coming down, but more lightly now, and the physical activity would be a welcome distraction. I hesitated at first, unsure if I wanted to venture into the cold, but the cabin was beginning to feel too small. I bundled up in my coat and boots and followed him outside, the freezing air biting at my cheeks. Ryan handed me a snow shovel and showed me how to use it properly, his voice patient and steady as he explained. I couldn't help but smile at his seriousness. It was just snow after all, but I appreciated the distraction. We worked side by side, the silence between us, broken only by the scrape of the shovels against the wooden porch. Every now and then, I caught him looking at me, his green eyes bright against the pale gray of the sky. I'd glance away quickly, my heart beating a little faster each time. At one point, I slipped. The snow beneath my boots was slick, and before I could catch myself, I went down hard, landing in a heap on the porch. "Careful." Ryan was at my side in an instant, his strong hands gripping my arms as he helped me to my feet. I tried to laugh it off, but my cheeks burned, both from embarrassment and the way his hands lingered just a little too long on my arms. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. "I'm fine," I said quickly, brushing the snow off my coat. But as I looked up at him, something shifted. His hands were still on my arms, his gaze locked on mine, and the air between us felt suddenly charged. For a moment, neither of us moved. The world around us seemed to fade away. The storm, the cold, everything except the intensity of his eyes and the warmth of his hands. Back inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly as I sat by the hearth, trying to shake the lingering tension from the moment outside. Ryan had gone to the kitchen to warm up some tea, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I couldn't ignore the way my heart had raced when he touched me, the way his eyes had lingered on mine, as if he was searching for something. It had been so long since I'd felt that kind of pull. So long since anyone had looked at me like that. I wasn't sure if I was ready for it, but the thought of Ryan's attention, of his touch, sent a warmth through me that had nothing to do with the fire. That evening, the storm began to ease, though the snow still fell steadily outside. We ate dinner together at the small kitchen table, the conversation light but tinged with something heavier. I was hyper-aware of everything. How close we were sitting, the sound of his breathing, the way his hand brushed mine as he reached for his glass. It was as if the storm outside had created a bubble around us, sealing us off from the rest of the world and leaving us with nothing but each other. Later, as we sat by the fire, Ryan broke the silence. "You've been quiet today," he said, his voice low. I didn't respond at first, unsure of how to put my feelings into words. Finally I said, "It's been a long time since I've been stuck like this, with no distractions." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Sometimes it's good to be still." I looked at him then, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his face. There was something in his expression, something steady and sure, that made my chest tighten. The moment happened so quickly, I barely had time to process it. 1 second we were sitting in silence, and the next Ryan had leaned forward, his hand brushing against mine. I looked up, startled, and found his face inches from mine, his green eyes searching mine for a sign, a signal, anything to tell him to stop. But I didn't stop him. When he kissed me, it was soft at first, almost tentative, as if he was giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, letting the warmth of his lips chase away every doubt, every hesitation. I don't know how long we stayed there, lost in each other. The fire crackled softly in the background, the storm outside now nothing more than a faint whisper. When we finally pulled apart, Ryan rested his forehead against mine, his hand still gently holding my waist. Neither of us spoke, the silence between us filled with 1,000 unspoken thoughts. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension. But words felt too small, too fragile for what had just happened. Instead, I let myself sink into the moment, the warmth of his body and the quiet intensity of his gaze grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. That night, I lay awake in the small bed, my thoughts a tangled mess. I replayed the kiss in my mind, the way his hands had steadied me, the way his eyes had lingered on mine. It had been so long since I'd felt anything like that, since I'd let myself feel anything at all. Part of me wanted to run, to build my walls back up and pretend that moment by the fire hadn't happened. But another part of me, a part I thought I'd buried long ago, wanted more. The storm outside had quieted, but inside I felt like a whirlwind. And I wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. The next morning, the cabin was cloaked in stillness. The snow outside had slowed to a gentle drift, flakes floating lazily to the ground, but the storm had left its mark. Banks of white piled high against the windows and blanketed the surrounding trees, muting the world into a soft, pale glow. I lingered in bed longer than usual, reluctant to face whatever the day might bring. My mind was a storm of its own, replaying the kiss from the night before. The way Ryan's touch had set something alight in me I hadn't felt in years. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and impossible to ignore. The rational part of me knew I should keep my distance, that whatever was happening between us couldn't lead anywhere good. But another part of me, the part that had spent so many years feeling invisible, unworthy of attention, didn't want to stop. By the time I emerged from the bedroom, Ryan was already up, a mug of coffee in his hand as he stood by the window, looking out at the snow-covered forest. He didn't say anything as I entered the room, and neither did I. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down on the couch, letting the warmth of the mug seep into my hands. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken things. I avoided his gaze, unsure of what I'd find there. Regret, confusion, or something else entirely. The day passed slowly, each hour stretching out into an eternity. We spent most of it in the quiet rhythm of routine, clearing snow from the porch, bringing in more firewood, and trying to keep the cabin warm as the temperature outside continued to drop. I tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Ryan. He was so close, yet so untouchable, moving through the small space with an ease that made me feel unmoored. Every glance, every accidental brush of his hand, sent a jolt through me, a reminder of the tension simmering just beneath the surface. I caught him looking at me more than once, his gaze lingering in a way that made my pulse quicken. But he didn't say anything, and neither did I. It wasn't until the late afternoon that the silence finally broke. I was sitting by the fire, flipping through one of the books from Ryan's shelf, when he came to sit across from me. The weight of his presence was impossible to ignore, and I felt my heart rate pick up as he settled into the chair. I tried to focus on the pages in front of me, but I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unwavering. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time all day. The intensity of his stare took my breath away. There was no hesitation, no doubt, just quiet certainty, like he'd already made up his mind. I don't know who moved first. One second, we were sitting across from each other, the fire crackling softly between us, and the next, he was there, pulling me into him with a gentle but insistent grip. His lips found mine, and the world around us seemed to disappear. There was no snowstorm, no cabin, no outside world, just the heat of his body and the way he made me feel like I was the only person that mattered. I let myself get lost in him, my hands tangling in his hair as his arms wrapped around me. There was no hesitation this time, no holding back. For the first time in years, I let myself want. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of warmth and closeness, a stark contrast to the cold storm still visible through the cabin windows. Ryan was attentive, his touch soft yet sure, his movements deliberate. He wasn't rushed or impatient, he took his time, as if he wanted to savor every moment. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed this, being touched, being wanted. My body responded to him in ways I'd forgotten it could, every nerve alive and humming under his hands. It wasn't just physical, though. There was an emotional weight to it, a depth that caught me off guard. He looked at me like I was something precious, something worth cherishing, and it made my heart ache in the best way. Afterward, we lay tangled together on the couch, the firelight casting soft shadows across the room. Ryan's hand traced lazy patterns on my arm, his touch light but grounding, as if he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing even as my body relaxed against him. I wanted to stay in this moment forever, to let myself believe that the world out didn't exist. But I knew better. "What happens when the storm ends?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Ryan didn't answer right away. Instead, he tightened his grip on me, his breath warm against my neck. "We'll figure it out," he said finally, his voice steady. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening to the steady rhythm of Ryan's breathing and watching the shadows dance across the walls. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Exhilaration, fear, hope, and doubt, all tangled together in a way that left me feeling raw and exposed. I hadn't planned for this, I hadn't planned for him. But now that he was here, I couldn't imagine going back to the way things were. And that terrified me. The next morning, the snow had stopped entirely. The world outside was bright and still, the sun reflecting off the fresh blanket of snow and casting everything in a blinding white glow. It was beautiful, serene, but it felt like a countdown had started, each ray of sunlight bringing us closer to the moment we'd have to leave this little bubble we'd created. Ryan was already up when I emerged from the bedroom, the smell of coffee filling the air. He looked up as I entered the room, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and easy. "Morning," I replied, my chest tightening at the sight of him. We spent the day preparing to dig out the truck and clear a path to the main road. The work was hard but satisfying, and for a while I let myself focus on the physical effort, the rhythmic scrape of the shovels against the snow. But as the day wore on, the reality of our situation began to creep back in. The storm had passed, and the world outside was waiting for us. That evening, as we sat by the fire one last time, the weight of what lay ahead hung heavy between us. Neither of us said much, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with all the things we couldn't bring ourselves to say. The hope, the fear, the uncertainty. I didn't know what would happen when we left the cabin. But for now, I let myself rest in the warmth of Ryan's presence, holding on to the quiet certainty of the moment for as long as I could. The world outside the cabin had transformed. The storm's rage had given way to calm, and the snow blanketing the mountains seemed almost untouched, pristine in the golden morning sunlight. But as beautiful as it was, it also meant our time in the cabin had come to an end. I stood by the window, watching Ryan dig out the truck from beneath layers of heavy snow. The sound of the shovel scraping against the driveway drifted through the frosted glass. Each stroke of his shovel felt like a countdown, a reminder that this perfect, impossible bubble we'd shared was about to burst. Behind me, the fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warmth doing little to ease the chill creeping into my chest. By mid-morning, the truck was free, its engine rumbling in the crisp mountain air. Ryan returned to the cabin, his cheeks flushed from the cold, a faint smile on his face as he brushed the snow from his jacket. "Roads look passable," he said simply. I nodded, my heart sinking. I'd known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, it felt too soon. Packing up didn't take long. My bag, which had seemed so heavy when I first arrived, felt impossibly light now. Each step I took around the cabin felt final, like I was erasing the traces of myself I'd left here. Ryan moved with quiet efficiency, checking the fire and locking up the windows, but there was a tension in his movements, a heaviness that mirrored my own. When everything was ready, we stood in the cabin's doorway, looking out at the snow-covered forest. The silence between us was heavy, filled with everything we weren't saying. Finally, Ryan turned to me, his green eyes steady. "You ready?" I wasn't. The drive down the mountain was uneventful, but it felt like something had shifted. The quiet between us wasn't the same as it had been in the cabin. It was tighter, more fragile, as if we were both afraid to break it. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment we'd shared over the past few days. The way his hands had felt on my skin, the warmth of his breath against my neck, the softness in his gaze when he thought I wasn't looking. It felt surreal now, like a dream I'd woken up from too soon. When we reached the edge of town, Ryan pulled into a gas station and parked the truck. "This is probably where we should part ways," he said quietly, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The words hit me like a punch to the chest, even though I'd known they were coming. I looked at him, searching for something, anything, to say, but the lump in my throat made it impossible. Instead, I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Thank you for everything." Ryan's gaze lingered on me, his green eyes soft but filled with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe. Or longing. For a moment I thought he might say something that would change everything. But he didn't. The drive back to my house was a blur. The streets were busy, cars rushing past me as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. When I pulled into my driveway, the house felt unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else. I stepped inside, dropping my bag by the door and standing in the entryway, unsure of what to do next. The silence was deafening. The days that followed were hard. I threw myself into work, filling my time with emails, meetings, and deadlines, but nothing felt right. My mind kept drifting back to Ryan, to the warmth of his cabin, the quiet strength of his presence, the way he'd looked at me like I was the only person who mattered. I tried to tell myself it was just the circumstances. We'd been thrown together by the storm, two strangers finding comfort in each other during an extraordinary situation. It didn't mean anything, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. A week after leaving the cabin, I found myself drafting an email to Ryan. I didn't know what I wanted to say, but the words poured out anyway. I told him about how much I missed the mountains, how the city felt suffocating now, how I couldn't stop thinking about him. But before I could send it, I hesitated. What if he didn't feel the same way? What if I was just a fleeting moment for him, a temporary distraction during the storm? I stared at the screen for what felt like hours before finally hitting delete. Life went on, but it felt colorless, like the snowstorm had taken all the vibrancy with it. I went through the motions, work, errands, the occasional dinner with friends, but everything felt muted, dull. I tried to push Ryan out of my mind, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard the low timbre of his voice, felt the warmth of his hands on mine. Then, one evening, there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I thought I might have imagined it. But the knock came again, louder this time. When I opened the door, my breath caught in my throat. Ryan stood on my porch, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, snowflakes clinging to his dark hair. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. "I couldn't stop thinking about you," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. He stepped inside, the cold following him as he closed the door behind him. I felt frozen, unsure of what to say or do. "I didn't know if I should come," he admitted, his gaze searching mine. "But I couldn't let things end like that, not without telling you how I feel." My chest tightened, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "I don't know if this can work," I said, my voice trembling. "We're from two completely different worlds." "I don't care about that," Ryan said, stepping closer. "What we had in that cabin wasn't just a moment, Helen. It was real, and I think you feel that too." His words broke something inside me. The walls I'd spent years building around myself, crumbling in an instant. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if we could make this work, or if it would all come crashing down in the end. But as I looked into Ryan's eyes, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't ready to let him go. Ryan's words hung in the air, the silence between us heavy and charged. He stood in my entryway, wet snow still clinging to his boots, his breath visible in the cold that had followed him inside. I hadn't moved, hadn't said a word since he'd told me he couldn't stop thinking about me. My heart was racing, every beat a reminder of how close I was to making a decision that could change everything. I wanted to speak, to tell him I'd felt the same, that I hadn't been able to go a single day without thinking about him either. But the words wouldn't come. Ryan didn't push me. He just stood there, his green eyes steady, his expression calm but expectant. "I don't want to overwhelm you," he said finally, his voice low. "But I had to see you, Helen. I couldn't leave things the way they were." There was something about the way he said my name, the way his voice softened like it was meant for me alone, that undid me completely. I stepped back, gesturing for him to come in out of the cold. He hesitated for a moment, then followed, closing the door behind him. The house suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer, with him here. Ryan slipped off his coat and boots, setting them neatly by the door, then stood there, waiting. I didn't know what to do with myself. Part of me wanted to rush to him, to wrap my arms around him and never let go. But another part of me, the cautious, guarded part that had spent years building walls, was still screaming at me to slow down. "Do you want coffee?" I asked finally, my voice breaking the silence. Ryan smiled faintly, nodding. "Sure." I moved to the kitchen, my hands trembling as I pulled out the coffee pot and started brewing. The familiar rhythm of the task grounded me, but I could feel Ryan's presence behind me, steady and unyielding. As the coffee brewed, I turned to face him, leaning back against the counter. He stood near the table, his hands in his pockets, his gaze never leaving me. "You didn't have to come here," I said quietly, my voice barely audible. I know, he replied. We sat at the table, the steaming mugs between us, the quiet hum of the heater filling the space. I hadn't realized how cold I was until I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting its warmth seep into my skin. Ryan didn't say much, and neither did I. But his presence was enough, steady and comforting, like the storm that had brought us together had left behind a calm I hadn't expected. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the house filled with soft evening light, I found myself sitting with Ryan on the couch. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was something else entirely. A quiet understanding that neither of us wanted to break. I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling. It was too big, too complicated, a tangled mess of fear and hope, and something that felt dangerously close to joy. As the evening wore on, Ryan turned to me, his expression soft. I know this isn't easy for you, he said. And I don't expect you to have all the answers right now, but I want you to know that I'm here, for however long it takes. His words broke something inside me, the last fragile barrier I'd been clinging to. I didn't respond with words. Instead, I leaned into him, resting my head against his chest. His arms came around me, holding me close, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself exhale. The days that followed felt like a dream. Ryan stayed, and for a little while, we let ourselves exist in a bubble of quiet intimacy. We went for long walks in the park, talked late into the night, and shared quiet meals at the kitchen table. It wasn't perfect. I still struggled with doubts, with fears about what people would think, about whether this could really work. But Ryan never wavered. He was patient, steady, always there to remind me that I didn't have to face it alone. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ryan reached for my hand. You don't have to decide everything now, he said. But I need to know if this is something you want, something we can build together. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked out at the horizon, the sky painted in soft hues of orange and pink. I don't know what the future holds, I said finally, but I know that I don't want to lose you. From that moment on, we stopped holding back. Ryan didn't go back to the mountains right away. Instead, he stayed, helping me adjust to this new chapter of my life. We faced the challenges together. The whispered comments, the disapproving glances, the endless questions about our age difference. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I wondered if we'd made a mistake, if the storm that had brought us together had left us chasing something that wasn't meant to last. But then, there were moments like this. Sitting on the porch with Ryan's hand in mine, watching the world settle into dusk, that made it all worth it. Months later, we returned to the cabin where it had all started. The snow had melted, replaced by a vibrant green that stretched across the mountains. The air was warm, the sky clear, and the cabin felt like a completely different place. We spent the weekend hiking the trails, sitting by the fire, and revisiting the memories that had brought us here. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Ryan turned to me, his expression soft but serious. I never thought I'd find someone like you, he said. I smiled, resting my head against his shoulder. I didn't think I'd let someone like you in. As the fire crackled softly and the night settled in around us, I realized something. The storm that had stranded us together had done more than change my plans. It had changed my life. For the first time in years, I felt alive, connected, and ready to take the leap into whatever the future held. With Ryan by my side, I knew I wouldn't face it alone.